Hey everyone, this is Dr. Maples. We're here to continue our survey lecture series. Now, first I want to talk about administering surveys. I want to give you some basic ideas about this, and I'm thinking in terms of print surveys in some of these, and in other cases I'm also thinking about online surveys. With this first one, we want to make sure our surveys are visually appealing. With an online survey, it pretty much does that by default, but if you're making a print survey in, say, Word, we want to make sure that it looks nice. Adding a border to it, which is a very simple thing to do. You can find YouTube videos to add borders to Word documents. Making sure all the font is the same. Bolding things that kind of help the reader understand what's going on. These are kind of the things that we do to make a survey visually appealing. With online surveys, you can do a lot of things, such as including entire themes that look really sharp. But that's quick and easy to do. It's really the print surveys that you need to spend more time with that. Second, you need to make sure that you don't ask questions that you don't need. The most common problem that I find with student surveys, and hear me out on this, the most common problem I find is that you ask a whole ton of questions that you don't really need. You ask the questions that you need, and then you ask a whole bunch of other stuff that you think is interesting, but you don't really need, and you're never going to analyze. Generally, in the past, when I've had students do survey assignments, I kind of let them run with this idea, and they build really massive surveys. And when we're in person, I can say, all right, you need to cut down like 60% of this survey because it's too long and you don't need all these questions. Since this is an online semester, it's harder to do that. So I want to kind of prepare you in advance to make sure as you build your research questions and your hypotheses that you ask only what you really need to know to answer those hypotheses. Now, if you're adding more, then maybe you need to add more hypotheses, but I promise you, if you're getting more than 15 or 20 questions, you probably have too many. So keep that in mind. If your surveys start getting really long, that's a problem. Likewise, if you have a print survey and it's more than a front and back page, it's probably too long. There's very rarely a reason for it to go any longer than that in the field and it be practical. So again, 15, 20 questions is maximum. And truth be told, for the assignments that you're going to do, for those of you who choose to do a survey, 10 questions is probably more realistic because your research questions are going to be fairly straightforward, I would imagine. Now, you always want to start a survey with softball questions. Softball questions are easy to answer questions that aren't scary, complicated. They just sort of ask people to respond to some things that in a casual conversation people might be willing to respond to. These can also be the rare example of a throwaway question where you ask a question that you have no intent on using. One of the things that I did in a past survey for the University of Tennessee, where I was asked to survey people about how they experience time in medical waiting rooms, was I asked them what their favorite color was, is the first question. And I had no intent on ever analyzing that, but I thought, that's a really easy question, and people are in a medical office. Let's just throw them an easy question. What's your favorite color? And I actually had room to throw in a second softball question where I said, hey, here's a picture of 6 different paintings. Which one's your favorite? And I had 6 different paintings that were famous, some Renoirs, some Dalis, and they got to pick their favorite. Those 2 questions, they were not anything that I needed, but they served the purpose of getting people engaged into what was actually a very detailed and almost maybe even mildly threatening survey because I was asking about some medical stuff. That was the rare exception of where I asked questions that I don't need. And so by doing a softball question, we give people some way to get engaged in the survey and feel like they're part of it. The idea is that, too, if you can get people to fill out a third of the survey, they'll probably finish out the last third. So that's kind of a way that we're thinking here. Likewise, really personal questions, they need to go either on the back page or near the end of the survey, including demographics. And we're going to talk about demographic questions in detail in this lecture, and I'm even going to give you preferred ways for listing these so you don't have to think about it or even come up with the categories. You can just literally cut and paste what I use in my surveys here to see that. You also need to check pitfalls. We will talk about pitfalls at the end of this lecture. These are common question errors, some comical, some disastrous, some that give you bad data. But nonetheless, we'll talk about pitfalls in a moment. You also need to take the time to test your survey. Ideally, you want to test this survey with the kind of people who will be responding to it. By that, I mean if I were doing a survey of rock climbers, I want rock climbers to test my survey. I do that with all of my surveys. I have the people that would be taking the survey fill it out and give me feedback on good questions, bad questions, and so forth. You also want to make sure your survey gives lots of directions. With the directions, we're telling them what to do. First, we'd like to know more about your experiences at Dollywood. Please tell us blah, 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 blah. But we're giving them direction here, for the Likert matrix. For this question, we'd like you to read the following items and tell us your level of support for each one. We're giving them directions. If there's a skip logic element where we need them to skip a question, we want to give them really clear directions. In fact, I often will bold print directions so that's kind of easier to see them. In fact, let's kind of start to transfer over into thinking about demographics. Demographics are some of the most important questions that we ask because they give us a sense of who we're talking to. These include things like sex, education, age, income. They can include gender as well. What we find is that, strangely enough, Gen Z, Gen X, and millennials, we are not as protective about this information as baby boomers and earlier. Previous generations, when you start asking questions about income, older generations don't want to tell you. It was weird because, I don't know, maybe there was just more expectation that you didn't tell other people your income. One of my students recently told me, with Gen Z, everybody's poor, so we don't mind telling other people what we make. I thought that was kind of funny. But younger generations don't seem to mind this as much, but with older generations, they got really sensitive. Because of that, we want to make sure that people will complete our survey to the end. So we want to put these questions at the end because sometimes they can feel threatening. We'll talk about threatening questions in a moment specifically, but we think that with a threatening question, it's a question that people go, I don't want to answer that. I don't know you. So these are some common ways of measuring demographics. Note that in some cases, these won't apply. So for example, if I'm doing a survey of college students, I probably don't need to ask about education. If I'm doing a survey and I happen to know or expect that everyone is the same sex, I probably didn't need to ask about sex either. But these are common examples of how I, a professional, measure these. So you feel free to copy these as you see fit. Now, education is something that measures their educational attainment or their maximum education. And the common way that I ask that is using these categories: less than high school degree or GED equivalent, because I need to be mutually exclusive there, but also exhaustive. Got to cover all the bases. Completed high school but no college, completed some college but no degree, and so forth. And you'll note also at the end that I put do not record. I put that in there because people may not want to give me that information. Now, do you notice how I put numbers at the end of that? Those numbers are actually coding. We're not going to talk about coding just yet, but I wanted to put them in there just so you could see that they're kind of a rising thing, right? As you get more education, you get a higher number. 8 isn't a category, and so we actually wouldn't analyze that 8. In fact, we would exclude that. We'll talk about that in a later lecture. But I just kind of want to give you a sense of what coding looks like. You wouldn't put those numbers on your survey, by the way. Here's another one, income. People feel really uncomfortable about income. Now, I do want to point out that there's a difference between household income and personal income. With household, we're talking about everybody that's in the household, and with personal, we're talking about one person's income. Likewise, too, don't make the different mistake that mean and median incomes are the same when you're working with county data, because they're not. One's mean and one's a median. But here, we're looking at household income. If you preferred, you could change the word household to personal for your survey. And you could even adjust the categories as you needed, or you could go completely continuous on your data there and just have them write in a number. What I personally find is the easiest thing is to give them the categories they have here. And look there, you see how I've got those numbers beside them? That's also how I would code them. So in my little data set, if they checked 0 to 19.9, I'm going to put a 1 because I don't really know that they need to know they put 0 to 19.9. I just need a number that I can use. We'll talk more about coding in our next lecture. Now, race is a very important and tricky one. Race is one that is, first off, partly established by the Census Bureau. And secondly, it is one that is changing. One of the things that I like to point out here is to make sure we're mutually exclusive and exhaustive is we include another race. You can make that a write-in question, so it can be something they can put their detail if they want. And I make this a check all that apply question because we want to make sure that the person taking the survey answers fully and gives us great information. And so if they have more than one race that they identify by, they're able to check those boxes. But this is the standard way of listing those, and you can read through those categories and cut and paste them. The sex measure is also another one. Now, this is one that's subject to change. Recently, I've been working with Dr. Allison Buck to get a more appropriate way of measuring sex. Sex talks about biological sex in this sense, and if you're interested in the differences on that, we have a Soc 205 and a Soc 399 course available for you. But in this question, we ask what sex was recorded on your birth certificate, and it gives them a chance to answer male, female, don't know, prefer not to answer. Now, this question always concerned me because we know that 17 of 1,000 children are born with some level of sexual indeterminacy. And then on top of that, sex indeterminacy, not sexual indeterminacy, for clarity there. And on top of that, too, I have a friend and a family member who have both gone through sex change surgeries. And so for me, I wanted to make sure this question was absolutely as inclusive as possible. So I asked about the birth certificate question. And the answer that I received really was astounding to me. Dr. Buck explained that as part of sex changes, you actually go through the process of legally changing your birth certificate to record the sex that you identify by now. So the question would make sense to that person. So I thought that was really cool. And the other one is that even though people are sometimes born intersex, there's actually not an intersex category on the birth certificate. A sex is still assigned. So this question should work. In the past, I've actually included another sex option. But that is an option that can feel, it's a kind of excluding people. It can feel kind of even rude. Accidentally, by trying to be inclusive, it can feel rude. So this is the question that's being suggested by an expert in that field. So that's the reason that I kind of wanted to share that with you. Same goes for this one. Gender is a very complicated thing to measure, and it's also something that's a social construct, like sex, like race, like ethnicity, that's going through changes right now. So again, working with Dr. Buck, I've established a really good gender measure that is acceptable and that other people are using. I didn't establish it. I'm just using what others have used here, which is common in surveys. You just use what other people have used. Gender is talking about expectations of how one behaves based on the sex that one might perceive looking at someone. So it's kind of the expectations that you might have for their behaviors. And the first version, option 1 on the left side of my screen, is a sort of generalized version. It could also include a prefer not to respond, which I didn't list on there, but that could be on there. But it gives people a chance to identify as man, woman, non-binary, or other. This also could include cisgender man, cisgender woman. The idea of cisgender is that you're saying that your gender lines up with how someone would expect you to behave based on your sex. But that term is now sort of falling out of use, it seems. So the preferred is, for at least now, is man and woman. Non-binary means that you simply adhere to a gender that falls outside of this binary of man or woman. And other gives you the freedom to respond as you'd see fit. And I would, again, of course, include prefer not to respond on this. Option 2 is more detailed and includes those first 3 categories, but it also expands on the idea of non-binary to include agender, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, gender queer, and other. Gender queer, as I understand it, is sort of another version of the term non-binary, and it's one that seems to be used as synonymous in some cases and not in others. And it's not a category that I fully understand, but the others that I can explain a little better. Agender means that you aren't applying to a particular gender. Gender fluid means that you are not staying with a static gender. Gender non-conforming means that your gender and your sex don't necessarily line up, which also kind of is the definition of non-binary, but not necessarily. Again, I'm not an expert in those, so what I do is fall back on the experts like Dr. Buck to help me make sure that I use these. But I use the option 1 measure if I am going to measure gender, just because for my purposes, in the rare instance that I would need a gender measure, I'm going to go for the simpler measure because I'm not doing gender research. So there you go. Those are ways that we measure demographics. What I now want to do is close with some basic pitfalls. With pitfalls, what we have are situations where people fall into the same traps over and over and over with bad question design. So I've got 4 of them, and just be aware of them, and you'll never have a problem with them. The first one is the double barrel question. It's where you're really asking 2 things. Like if I ask you to tell me, do you like dogs and cats? Yes or no? Well, maybe I like dogs, but I don't like cats. Or maybe I don't like cats, but I like dogs. Or maybe I don't like either of them, but I'm not sure what I'm saying no to. That's a double-barreled question. There's really 2 questions there. First question is, do you like dogs? The second question is, do you like cats? But if I say, do you like dogs and cats? Well, what am I answering yes to? I'm not really sure. That's a double-barreled question. Threatening questions are questions that we put in there too early that tell us or ask us to say things that are very scary. So if question 2 of my survey was, please tell us about your recreational drug use in your own words. And we're not there yet by question 2. Really, like question 7 might be where you could get away with asking that. You need some softball questions, right? If you ask someone about something like that, it's kind of sensitive. Same thing goes for measuring demographics and all sorts of questions where people will just be like, I don't know if I want to give that to a stranger. But I'm always going to be willing to tell people what my favorite color is because that's innocuous and doesn't matter. So we use a softball question to warm people up to those kinds of questions. A leading question is where we're basically telling them what we want to say. Would you say that you support candidate X because they're tough on crime? Well, who could say they're not tough on crime? Of course I support candidate X. Who is candidate X? They're tough on crime? Yeah, we want to be tough on crime. Or maybe you have a strong aversion to the idea of being tough on crime. And so, of course, no, I'm against that person. This is where we're giving them a leading question. We're telling them the reason they might vote for a person or choose a certain answer. The last one is the funniest one sometimes, and it's just simple wording. You, of course, want to make sure that your questions don't have typos and that they're clear and specific and that they make sense if you read them aloud. But you also want to make sure that you communicate what you're really trying to get at. I remember I saw a survey, and one of the questions was, what color is your state? And I really pondered on what that question meant, like all day long after I just stopped taking the survey because I was like, well, this makes no sense. What color is your state? The question that they were actually asking is your state a majority Republican state or a majority Democrat state? But they asked, what color is your state? And what they should have said is, what's the predominant political party in your state? Or is your state largely Democratic or Republican or a mix? But what they were really asking is, are you a red state or a blue state? I didn't get that until many hours later when I kind of realized what they were asking. On those pitfalls, those are the 4 that you're always going to run into. There's others, but believe me, these 4 are the ones that you're going to face as an undergrad. You be aware of those, you're going to do just fine. Now, we're going to finish up in our next lecture talking about surveys, but begin thinking about what you might want to do for your assignment. If you like surveys, you can design a survey for your first assignment. And if you're not into surveys, that's okay. You can choose one of the later things because we got 3 more options that we're going to talk about. But we're going to leave it there. If you got questions, you know where to find me. Otherwise, I'll see you later. Take care.